here. So this is sort of a new beginning in a way. You should feel privileged, but I am very excited for this because my guest tonight is someone who I've known through social media, through reputation, a positive reputation, by the way, that I've heard from other people in the community. But we've communicated virtually, but we've never had a longer conversation, I don't think, than 5 minutes. My guest tonight is First United Methodist Church. Is it Reverend, Minister, Pastor? What's the correct term here? Scott, I think you're frozen a little bit. But we're going to roll anyway. Can you hear me okay? Ooh. I think we're locked up just a little bit. I think we're going to shut it down and try it one more time. All right. Without Chuck Walker, my guest tonight is First United Methodist Church, Reverend Sky McCracken. Sky, we were talking before we started recording. You and I have never really had a conversation over 5 minutes, and I'm glad that tonight we're finally getting to do that, even though it's not in person. I think I always thought it would be in person, maybe over an adult beverage or two.
We've needed to do this for a while, so I'm glad we're getting to do it.
This will be good. I'm very excited. I've mentioned your name in a couple of articles I've written, obviously in the post promoting the show tonight. So I just want to tell you personally, I have respected the work that you and your church have done for a long time. So I'm honored to get to just sit down and talk to you for the next hour about a lot of difficult topics.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to
it. So first thing,
a lot of difficult topics out there.
They are. Tell me just a little bit about you. I know you have a past in officiating because that's a commonality we share. But are you a native West Tennessean or are you from somewhere else? I don't even know that.
I am. I was born and raised in Martin, and actually went ahead and went to college there. That was a deal couldn't pass up. Got a great education. My dad was a college professor at Martin, and was there the first 22 years of my life. Went to seminary at Emory University in Atlanta and was there for 3 years. I needed to get out of Tennessee for a while. And I have served churches in Georgia during seminary, West Tennessee, and West Kentucky since about 1987. And yes, I was a sports official too for about 30 of those years. In fact, I told you the other day, I umpired my first college baseball game with your dad at UT Martin.
How did he do? Was he okay?
Oh, he was great. He was watching me, but when it was a doubleheader and when we got there, he said, you're up first, don't you? And I said, I guess I do now. So I got suited up and got behind the plate, and he was super.
He's not someone that people naturally find it easy to say no to. I don't know what he was like back then. I know growing up, he was sort of intimidating. So, just if he would have told me you're up first, I'm like, all right, I got you. Yes, sir. I'll get my stuff. Were you always?
He was checking me out, make sure I knew what I was doing.
That's what he does. And from everything I've heard, he was a pretty good official. Let me ask you this before we get into the heavy stuff. I'll give you an easy question. What was your favorite sport to officiate?
Basketball.
Same. Me too. But why was basketball your favorite?
I think it was because it was the most challenging. I probably wasn't as good a basketball official as I was a baseball umpire, but I liked to challenge a basketball better.
Mm-hmm. I liked the movement of basketball. I also liked if I blew a call, like we were just rolling. We're going back down the other end, and everybody's going to forget about it in 2 possessions anyway, and we can move on. Baseball feels like an eternity. You blow a call behind the plate, and you're just sitting there for about 30 seconds before the next pitch is thrown, it feels like 30 minutes and everybody's just on you.
There is no hiding from a baseball game. So, yes, you're right. Basketball is so quick. You're moving and you're moving and you're moving. But baseball, make one bad call in the game and it's going to stick with you through a doubleheader.
This might be a weird question, and I promise I'm not stretching this to try to connect it to our larger conversation. But for me, officiating basketball actually helped me in tense situations in my real life. If that makes any sense, it slowed me down a little bit. It allowed me to like look at things a lot more objectively in a heated moment. Was that the same way for you as well? Do you think was there some kind of translation in that?
It was excellent training and experience for me because, particularly from basketball, I would often replay a scene or a play in my head before I made a call. And when I am having conversations with people, I tend to replay what I heard before I respond. So I try to make sure I listen and listen well. And then instead of waiting for a zinger, I wait for a good response. So yeah, without a doubt. In fact, I've said that before. I think it was excellent for what I do and working with people.
It's interesting how these different things that don't seem related a lot of times are or can be, and the things that we practice or the way that we respond to intense situations in different parts of our lives, if we learn how to sort of harness that emotion, it can help in other situations. And before we sort of
Hmm.
jump into these deep waters of the
Absolutely.
conversation that we're going to have tonight, I can imagine that you've probably faced a lot more tense situations as a minister than you ever did on a baseball field or a basketball court. Because these are, I mean, sports are wonderful, but they're still in the end a game. The things that you probably have to deal with on a day-to-day basis are can be heavy, I guess. Did you always know that you wanted to be in ministry, even growing up? Was that something that you knew from an early age?
Excuse me. No, not at all. In fact, I originally thought I was going into medicine. I thought I was going to be a physician. I had shadowed a few doctors. Wasn't sure that's the kind of life I wanted to lead, even though I knew I was called to come some kind of help profession, service, that sort of thing. I worked at our area denominations camp for 2 years. I was a waterfront director, but I also was their musician. I played the guitar, and it's hard to take a piano out in the woods, as they say. So one night, the young ladies who were on staff asked me to stay one night after a worship meeting or worship service, and said, Sky, have you ever considered being a minister? And I'd seen a lot of nerdy men ask me that question at camp, the ones that wear dark socks and sandals and all that. And I was like, well, there's no way I'm called to do that. But they said, we've thought about this, we've discerned about it, we've prayed about it. This is what we think God is calling you to do. And so when I went back to school, one of them would call me every night, and that was long distance. Have you seen your minister yet? Have you asked him about going to candidacy studies? And finally, to get them off my back, I enrolled in candidacy studies, and I told the pastor, I'm just doing this to make some people happy. And as we started to go through the sessions, and he agreed, say, yeah, let's just make these girls happy, get them off your back, that sort of thing. And about halfway through, he said, God speaks, and sometimes in weird places, and it may be God may be speaking through these three women. They may know what they're talking about, and here I am. I would have
Wow.
never dreamed I was doing this when I was 19, 20 years old.
Um, were you raised Methodist?
I was. My mom and dad, when we moved to Martin, uh, I started going to First Methodist. Back then, it was First Methodist. It wasn't United Methodist yet. That was 1968. So it was kind of a university church, and a lot of my friends went there. Grew up there, involved in the youth group there. Certainly a part of my life. I actually thought I might help the church one day being a volunteer musician.
Hmm.
I just didn't see myself being up there behind the pulpit. That I never entertained that on a wild dream when I was a kid.
Did you start out in ministry as a reverend or pastor, or were you a youth minister first, or did you start out with your own church first job in ministry?
I did youth ministry for a year at a church, and then I was approached by a district superintendent if I would serve two churches, uh, knowing that I was going to seminary the next year and going away from here. And I served two small churches right across the Kentucky state line in college. And man, they heard some bad sermons. But they taught me a lot about what it's like to be a pastor in a small church in a small community. Yeah, I've been doing this. I've been pastoring the church since 1987. So that's what
Almost 40
37
years.
years.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that flew by.
So as we jump into this, I want to give you just a little bit of context from sort of where I'm coming from. I don't want to rehash it a lot because I have in the past over and over in writing and on the radio and things like that as well. I grew up in church. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I was deeply religious for a while, up until probably my mid-20s. I was also a youth minister at Calvary Baptist Church here for a couple of years as a deacon. So I was a Christian studies minor at Union. And it's funny, when I was growing up as a Southern Baptist, I didn't really know anything else. I had friends that went to the Methodist church, but to me, I was like, oh, those Methodists, they're pretty wild, right? Like I forgot the joke of there's a liquor store joke about Baptists and Methodists, and I'm not going to try to tell it because I'm going to mess it up. You might know it. Do you know it?
Oh, I know it well.
Okay. Do you want to tell it? I think you need to tell it.
What's the difference? What's the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist? A Methodist will speak to you at a liquor store.
There you go. Okay. So, growing up, that was sort of like, that was pounded into me. Like, don't drink. Like, there were these just very simple things you cannot do. Don't drink. Don't have sex before you get married. And there was a third one, and now I just can't remember it. But as long as I wasn't doing any of those three, I felt okay about myself. And I didn't do any of those things. High school, I was clean as a whistle. And I was in church the summer after my senior year. And it was the first time, this was 97. It was the first time I'd ever heard, and I'm going to use the word politics, but it's not, I don't know that this was politics back then. It was the first time I heard any kind of social issue brought forth from the pulpit. And it really rubbed me the wrong way, and I didn't know why. Our pastor, at the very end of the service, for whatever reason, talked about Disney World and boycotting Disney because either they had held a pride parade or they had given their employees benefits as a couple if they were in a same-sex relationship before LGBTQ marriage was legal, right? So it was one of those things. I don't remember which one exactly it was, but he said something about to not buy Disney products and to not go to Disney movies. And the movie Hercules was out at the time. And I remember turning to my friend, who was actually the pastor's daughter, and I said, I'm going to see Hercules this afternoon. And I was making a joke, but I was also being serious because something about that coming from the pulpit really made me feel away. I didn't like it. I didn't think that was what he should have been saying from the pulpit. And I didn't know why I didn't like it. And I didn't really think about it a lot after that. I just kind of kept going the way I was going. But as I've gotten older, um, and been through a lot of different phases in my spiritual journey until where I am currently now, which is completely out of it and just watching from the outside. I've seen this type of conversation ramp up a lot within religious circles and denominations. And I know that the Collective Methodist Church is going through maybe, I don't know if tense is the right word, um, but the questions I'm going to ask you tonight are honestly, it's a lot of them are just coming from me being curious and wondering how these things play out
Sure.
over time. You said you've been a minister for 40 years. So the first question that I'm going to kind of lob out there to you and let you run with is, over your 40 years in ministry, how much has the cultural evolution, I don't know if affected the church is the right way, how much impact has it had on the church? And in your opinion, like what is the right response from the church to the way culture has shifted? I mean, we can say 40 for almost 40 years because that's how long you've been pastoring, but really in the last 10 years, culture has shifted a ton, I think. I know that's a large question, so I'll let you kind of take bite-sized pieces of it and go with it, or however you want to answer it.
Uh, well, let me take it in bites. When I was starting in ministry, in seminary, and probably the first 10 years out of seminary, racism was the hot topic. And racism hasn't gone away. It's just kind of shifted to a different ism.
Mm.
And there are a lot of isms right now. But, I was still dealing with the effects of integration in schools. It had happened in my lifetime. It was still fresh on people's minds. Folks had different interpretations and different feelings about it, particularly where schools were concerned. I lived here in Jackson in the 90s. We were
Mm.
still under federal court order. We still had buses that were taking kids to school, and they had to go to a certain school and all that sort of thing. Um, so that was still fresh. It had not been fixed by the civil rights movement. My denomination said they fixed that in 1968 when we became the United Methodist Church, but we were still split as black and white churches for the most part. So I saw that being very fresh, and as a pastor, still occasionally came up, particularly if there was a couple and one was black and one was white wanted to get married. Some folks in the church just absolutely went crazy. I did a wedding for two folks who had been previously married before to different people, had gone through a terrible divorce, and there were some folks that thought they had no business being married in the church. Uh, so those were the things that if you want to say, I learned on as far as the clash between culture and church. I didn't see the clash of partisan politics then, and I don't think it was as bad. It was still a running ribbing. If you were a Democrat and someone else was a Republican, you razzed each other about your choices. And that was as far as it went, as far as going to play golf, as far as going to go out for a couple of beers, as far as your family's doing stuff together. It didn't make a hill of beans. But then as society got increasingly politicized, it rubbed down and rubbed off on the church to the point where you are identified by the church you belong to or the denomination you belong to. If you're an independent, which church do you belong to? If you are a Protestant, which denomination do you attend? Gosh almighty, in America, if you're Catholic and you're in a large area, which parish do you belong to? Because there are conservative parishes and there are liberal parishes. So that has evolved, and I have seen that particularly heightened in the last 10 or 15 years. And then all of that often gets in the way of a measured Christian, ethical, moral response to a lot of the issues that a lot of folks rush to on the ballot.
Mm.
And instead of having informed wrestling sessions about what do these things mean, what are the implications of that, how does a person of faith address those things, politics usually wins over theology just about every time in America. And so being a minister in that environment has made it interesting. Go ahead.
Why do you think politics wins? And because I agree. Like, I think I completely 100% behind you on that. Do you think that's because there are just narratives and on both sides, right? Like left and right, that are so salacious that they're easy to latch
Mhm.
onto and they're easily explainable? Because theology is not easily explainable. Like and you said it, like it's different denominations, even different parishes. There's liberal, there's conservative, even within the Catholic Church. And so it's hard to sort of wade through those waters. Is politics just easier to latch onto in your mind?
I think it can be. Politics can certainly, and it is in this era, is more of a black and white issue for folks. Now, having said that, I see more turmoil in politics within the political parties than I do across the political parties. I think that's just sport going across the parties. That didn't change a whole lot. It might have gotten a little deeper and nastier, but the turmoil within the parties, I think, has gotten worse. And I think as you see at the state level, where you have some supermajority parties, uh, they they're bloody, bloodier than the across the aisle arguments are, and that has ramped up this communal angst that exists. It just seems to be endemic across the United States. Everybody's in a state of angst. Everybody is looking for a fight. Everybody is looking for a defense on whatever is going to come out of your mouth. I'm going to come out with a statement that is defensive, and that is a terrible way to live in community with each other. And I don't apologize from the religious side. God created us to be in relationship with each other, but we do not practice that well. And I dare say we practice it worse now in our country than we did 20, 40, 50 years ago.
Um, Man, I've got like three follow-up questions. I'm trying to figure out which one I want to ask. I guess the follow-up is going to be, yeah, I'm going to ask this one. How much do you think social media has played a huge role in this? And if so, have you seen the tensions between sides or even within parties, like you said, have those been elevated in the last 5 to 10 years, even more so than before?
Absolutely. Social media, I think, gives a pseudo anonymity to things. Your name or your handle or your nickname or your whatever you go by in social media is about the only identification you have to another human being. And, I do try to pride myself on being a person of peace. But most of these conversations that happen on social media, if they happen face to face, somebody would end up with a fist in their mouth.
Yes, they would.
And that's not going to happen on social media. I guess somebody's got an icon of somebody putting a fist up or something, but you wouldn't talk that way and get away with it very long if you were talking to human beings like that. So I think that has ramped up the angst, and it twists the narrative terribly, so that you cannot have a decent uh, conversation where people actually listen to each other because they're in social media mode. Keyboard warriors out there, what can I type out next? Instead of what is this person saying, where are they coming from, and how do we communicate?
Look, I fell into that trap an hour before we started recording, and even though I am trying to constantly be aware of those things, it's like sometimes it's just a response, and then I realize that I just responded that way, and I feel bad about it. But then it's like, well, it's already out there, so it's just there. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Right.
I think social media has. I mean, obviously there are benefits. There are benefits to everything, any kind of new technology. But then there's also the other side of that coin, which, man, it has really fractured communication. I think in our culture, and overall, I think it's done a lot of harm. So here is the next two questions. They're sort of the same, and I'm going to start with more of a general one, and then I'm going to focus it more on you personally. The first one is, what do you think the church's role in? Do they have a role in politics? Because it does seem like politics is everywhere, right? So some people will be like, well, it's politics. Don't talk about politics. But it seems like everything is politics. Like you can't separate. It's hard to separate
Mm-hmm.
political things from social issues because, and we've seen this in our own city, those things tend to marry themselves together, or people marry them together, and then they legislate based on that. So does the church have a role in that arena? If so, what is it? And if not, how do they respond to these things?
Words undergoes such transformation, and some of them in a very short time. The word politic has been around for a long time. It basically meant the affairs of the city, and see how it affected the welfare of people. That was politic. That was where that word came from. So obviously, the church has a vested interest in the health and the welfare of the people in the city. Do we have a role to take on the partisan take of politics? My answer would be no. I think most folks, if they listed the things that were near and dear to them, that mean the most to them, would have a hard time picking one of our parties in the United States. It's one of the reasons why I think having partisan candidates for local offices is such a mistake, because it asks people to pick a philosophy or say somebody's team over an individual who has vested interest in the community. And communities, I think it was Tip O'Neill that said it, that all politics are local, and they are. And some of the things that affect the United States and partisan politics really don't affect Jackson, Tennessee that much, and vice versa. Our needs are unique to our community. So, yes, the church should be involved in the body politic of a community, of its heart. But as far as taking the partisan side, or listing the platform and say that's where our beliefs conform to, that's heresy. The early Christians would almost probably look at us in abhorrence to see that we took somebody's side. Jesus himself was, render to Caesar, but render to God what is God's. And I always thought it was funny that when he said who's on the coin, and he had to ask somebody for a coin because he didn't have one himself. So I don't think Jesus didn't play that game, and I don't think we should either. But that doesn't mean the church is hands off from the affairs of the state. But it must be thoughtful, and it can't cross its integrity.
For you personally, has this increase in tensions in society and politics, everything that we've talked about leading up to this, has it been more challenging to be in your position, or is it just business as usual?
It's been more challenging. I always believe in being transparent with people. There have been times that I've been tempted to despair. I look over almost 40 years of what I've been doing, and I say, did this make a difference at all? Could I have just remained a layperson and done my part instead of submitting myself to all this? And then I realized, that's a pity party. Everybody's got tough jobs. Your job's not any tougher than anybody else's. The situations are different. But I've found myself tempted to despair and sometimes even resentful that people major in the minors, and I spend more time trying to help folks with the minors and staying out of the ditch than being on the road. So I've had my frustrations. Age helps a little bit. It's the saying from Ecclesiastes, nothing's new under the sun. People have seen this before. This is not the first time a society's gone through this. It won't be the last. So I temper all of my frustrations with history and know that we've been here before. And it's a measure of our faith, what legacy we leave for our children and our grandchildren. And so that matters. So that keeps me in the game, as they say, more moved and called than ever to be faithful to what I do, to love God, love people, and love the world. And some days that's a challenge, and other days it's not that difficult. So, you caught me on a good day.
Good. I'm glad. We were talking. Well, before
Yeah.
I reached out to you, I kind of did it, not a deep dive. I Googled you, put Sky McCracken in Google because I wanted to see, because I know that you've been prominent in not issues in Jackson, but it seems like when the Jackson Sun needs to talk to a minister about something, they would ask you the question. So I knew you had a lot of quotes out there, and so I read back through some old articles on the Jackson Sun. I think some went back as far as 4 or 5 years ago. And what struck me was every quote that you gave seemed to be wrapped in some type of empathy and grace for whatever the situation was. And one of those articles was about, I don't know if split is the right word to use, but there was some type of tension within the Methodist Church several years ago. And I don't even know what the issue was. It may have been the LGBTQ issue. Again, I've forgotten what the issue was. But you had a quote that went something like this: the Methodist Church has gone through, I'm going to say, splits before. And I think you referenced the split of the African American Methodist Church and the First United Methodist Church way back in the 1800s at some point, and how that was amicably resolved. And you said there is an appropriate way to break apart. I think there was something like that. Can you, and this is just my personal question because I'm not familiar with a lot of the Methodist Church history. What are some of the big issues that has sort of the collective Methodist Church has faced in the last several years that's caused some of that tension? And I don't want to use the word split again. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but has caused some of that consternation within that church. What are some of those
Mhm.
issues, and how have those been resolved?
For the bulk of the history of Methodism in America, it was race. Uh, we had a bishop who lived in the South who owned slaves. That started a huge fight, and so we split much like the United States split North and South. There was a Methodist Episcopal Church, and there was a Methodist Episcopal Church South, and there were a few who just wanted to ditch bishops altogether, and they became the Methodist Protestant Church. which my father actually was one of the last of the Methodist Protestants, because in 1939 all those denominations merged back. And they merged back because they realized that was an issue that had been more informed by emotions and politics than it had been formed by Bible and faith. And even the 1939 merger was not free of racism, because they created a separate but equal situation with African American Methodists in the United States, and so they had their own jurisdiction, so to speak. So while we were the same denomination, we still were separate. But that was a compromise to make that happen. And I'm not defending that in any way. It wasn't until 1968 that all those things came together.
What was
there has been growing tension. It's no,
wait, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've just got one question. What was the biblical basis for separating a church by race? Or was there one, or was it just more of the way the culture was at the time in America?
It was more of the way the culture was. There were some loose scriptures that were thrown out. They were very poor attempts at using scripture, but and just the fact that slavery was justified and there wasn't any New Testament prohibition against it. So folks thought they had God on their side. Same thing in the Civil War. Folks thought they had God on their side. And so, an unfortunate part of our history. Every day I walk past our church out front. It still says Methodist Episcopal Church South. It's written in stone, or it's carved in stone. I'd like to get rid of it. I don't know an easy way to do that, but other folks say, no, you need to remember, don't throw away the past. It still exists. So, it is what it is. For the last 40 years, in at least the United Methodist Church, human sexuality has been an issue. Well, since 1972, added a provision in the Book of Discipline about homosexuality is not compatible with Christian teaching. That had not ever been in the Book of Discipline before, our church law. And that's been contentious for the last 50 years. And finally, the straw broke the camel's back, and we did have a split in our denomination over that. It was not a neat split; it was more like a splintering. We had some folks that went to a new denomination. We had folks that stayed in our denomination, and we had a lot of churches that went independent, including a church here, a couple of churches here in Jackson chose to be independent rather than go with another denomination. So I have a lot of deep love and respect for folks that I disagree with on that issue. I think it was inevitable, and I think this is where the quote came from the Sun. There are ways to divorce well, and there are ways not to, knowing that God's probably not the happiest with a divorce to begin with. But we don't, when the divorce is final, we don't berate our former spouse. We don't pile ashes on their head, and we don't stalk them and make their life hell. We try to get along the best we can, and I think that's where we're at now. And there are folks that are still not happy with how all that's kind of trickled down in the denomination. I don't think anybody's ever happy. I don't rejoice over that. I know it's a reality. And in America, we are just so deeply polarized over so many issues. It would be it'd be difficult to find a fellowship of people who agreed on everything. That's in America. I think that's asking for the impossible.
I still keep in touch with my youth minister from Calvary from when I was in high school. Like, we're still friends. He's in Clarksville now. He was in New Jersey for a long time. And living in New Jersey sort of, I don't want to say opened his eyes. It's just it's a different culture. in the Northeast than it is in the Bible Belt
Mm-hmm.
in the South down here, where you and I have probably, lived our entire lives. Um, and I told him, and this is when I told him this, it was a couple years ago. So this is the version of myself that's sort of watching all of this from the outside unfold now after being in it for such a long time. And I told him, I said, I think the church is going to look at same sex marriage the same way they look at mixed race marriage now, 20 years down the road. Like, we're going to look back at this and be like, why was this such an issue at some point? That's just me seeing this from the outside. Am I naive to think that? Or do you think that's probably how we're going? This is going to be a thread, like almost like mixed race marriages were 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
I think it will be a little slower than mixed race marriages and such, but I think, I always tell folks there are two measures of things that we ought to worry about as legacy of the church. Is one, what will God say about us? And the second is, what will our grandchildren say? And, history has not always been kind to us as a church, but we're evolving just like everyone else. Homosexuality, LGBTQ issues are not easy. There are scriptures read in context and read out of context that make it at best a difficult issue to try to resolve, if it can be resolved at all. There are 6 scriptures, 3 Old Testament, 3 New Testament, that are used in this argument and in this subject. And I don't value them, devalue them any more than any else. But one of the other things about the Bible is money and its use is mentioned over 800 times. However, we don't seem to be as concerned as a society about how we spend our money and how individuals spend their money, how the collective politics spends its money. I said this in a sermon on Sunday. I said, it was a conservative estimate, but something like $120 billion will be thrown into the presidential election this year, or this cycle. $120 billion will be thrown into the political cycle just to elect one person to one office. Now, if I were a Bible thumping, stomping, by the book guy, I would probably want to say, I think that's great. I want all these folks audited. Are they giving that much to the church? Because where your heart is where your treasure is. That's right out of the book. So we have been. We choose the sins that we like to beat up. And I'm one of them. There are a lot of fat preachers in this world. Gluttony is one of the 7 deadlies, but we never, ever bring that up. And as a nation, that probably causes more health problems than alcoholism does. But the church will give gluttony a pass and will come down on anybody who's ever struggled with alcoholism. So we got a lot to learn.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that was my next question. Because I am, man, we are very much, it seems like, in sync with the way, or at least the things that I've been thinking throughout a lot of my adult life. Like, why do we major on these issues, but we seem to ignore these issues? Like, I've always thought about that. And even, like I said, when I was heavily involved in church, even as an adult, this was around 2005 when marriage equality was being talked about, and there was a possibility, and people were freaking out. And I say people in church were freaking out, and I just didn't understand, like, why, like, what, I don't understand what the big deal about this is. So is it because it's easy to beat up on because the majority of people in the South who go to church aren't gay, so they don't understand it, so it's easy for them just to, like, pop it on the head all the time because it doesn't affect them? Because I'm divorced, and it was my fault. And I've been very transparent about why I got divorced. I had an affair. It's something I regret. It happened almost 20 years ago, but I would have been welcomed right back into my church had I just said, "Hey, I'm sorry for what I did," and nobody would have batted an eye. But a person who did far less moral damage to another person who happens to be gay and in a committed relationship, they would have a hard time letting them into that church. I always had an issue with that. And so I think, like, why is this particular issue such a hot topic for people in church?
I think some of it's the issue itself. I mean, for example, I know some folks who are extremely conservative. They either have gay children or gay siblings. And politically, if you were to list all the things that make somebody a quote unquote conservative, they would fit. But on the issue of human sexuality, it's not an issue for them. Know some folks who are extremely progressive. Again, check off all the marks that you go down the list. They would fit in and be a bona fide progressive. But when it comes to human sexuality issues, they can't get past the ick factor. So, folks are not monolithic on their understanding of human sexuality either. And quite frankly, human sexuality is complicated. It has always been complicated. It's been complicated for the church. The King James Bible does not have the word homosexual in it. And there's a reason for that. The word wasn't coined yet. That word doesn't translate well. There's two words in the New Testament Greek that don't translate very well. It could be effeminate man. It could be like a woman, which brings up really interesting point that somebody noted me once. Says, well, Bible really doesn't say too much about lesbians as much as it does gay men. I said, you're exactly right. It doesn't. And he said, why is that? I said, I don't know. That's a good question. Most of my deep theological questions end up with that answer. Said, I don't know. That's a really good question. But at best, it is problematic. And also, at best, it is not a resolved issue. And so I'm very careful in my conversations to listen because people have valid points on both sides of that issue. But there is a thing that goes beyond that, and it involves sexuality as well. When sexuality becomes exploitive, when it becomes hurtful, when it becomes a weapon, definitely the church has something to say. And it seems to have taken the edge off of how exploitive sex is in society today, that we've just focused on LGBTQ issues. And as we said earlier, the LGBTQ community is not monolithic in all these issues either. So some folks who think they have them pigeonholed and taking a pride flag and going down Main Street and waving around, most folks in the LGBTQ community are not wired that way. Right. They're like me. I don't have any bumper stickers on my car. Never been a bumper sticker guy. They are who they are. They try to live their lives the best they can and as faithful as they can. And quite frankly, I'm glad to have anyone in the church who's trying to live up to the ideals of Jesus Christ and not in church at all. And unfortunately, there are lots of good reasons not to go to church in our society. And for that, I'm truly ashamed.
A couple years ago, and I sort of want to bring this. We've had this general conversation about the collective church, the Methodist Church, and your experience within that. A couple years ago, here in Jackson, we had almost like the culmination of these tensions, like hit a fever pitch with the drag show. And the reason I bring that up is because in some of the articles I was reading in my research about you, like that was one of those. And you were part of that, I don't know if team is the right word, group of people who were having discussions about it. And like your quotes about the split of the Methodist Church, every quote in that article was also sort of shrouded in this grace and empathy. It didn't seem to like take a hardline stance on the issue itself, but you seem to care more about the people involved. Did I read those quotes the right way? Is that sort of where you were coming from?
Oh yeah, that's very accurate.
When you were having to deal with that, like coming from a human perspective, because even though I'm not in church anymore, like whenever I have conversations with people, they're like, well, if you don't believe this, you don't believe that, like where do you start? Well, I like to start with the humanity of a situation, right? So how does this affect the actual person in it, right? Like not a political side, one side or the other, but how does this affect the person? When you started from that angle, like what were your, I don't want to say thoughts or philosophies about a quote unquote drag show? What were your concerns about the people who were being affected by it? And I don't mean the people who are worried about their kids seeing a person dressed up like a woman. I mean that maybe the people on the other side of that.
Well, for one, it's a change. I think folks thought the activism of the '60s and '70s was over, and that brings back some of those memories for those who were around. I was concerned about your average uh, gay or straight person who have folks that they love who have wrestled with that issue their whole life, and now everyone is being put into a box that everybody thinks that's how all gay and lesbian people are. All of them are deviant. All of them are purveyors of flesh. All of them are living for the moment, which is far from the truth. It never got a lot of press, but the Pride Board wrestled within itself on trying to make decisions on handle all that, and they were not of one mind on that issue. And some folks made hay out of it. They made political hay out of it. They made religious hay out of it. To me, that's another form of exploitation of sex. You can kind of cloud it under the guise of religious righteousness indignation, but I don't think that's the right response. I think good Christian people disagree. Some folks say, well, what if we're wrong? And I said, well, golly Moses, we can go back to the Reformation. What if Protestants are wrong? We left the church. Is God ever going to forgive us for that? What if the Orthodox were right in 1054 instead of the Catholics? Maybe we're all supposed to be Orthodox. Who's right, who's wrong? And the deal with being Protestants, and most of us around here there aren't that many Catholics around. If you're a Protestant, there's going to be a lot of different biblical interpretations because everybody can get a Bible and everybody can read it. They can read it at various strengths, levels, and depths, but everybody is free to interpret. So, we call that a strength, but in other ways, it's a weakness. Everybody's entitled to their own interpretation. Such is the soup, or maybe the stew is a better word, such is the stew that is the church in America. I still believe in it. I certainly believe in God and all the things that have been bestowed to us from God, including God's word. But at the same time, it's messy. I think the Bible is the most wonderful book that society's ever had. I think it's God inspired. I think the folks who were moved by God to write and testify did the best job that they could in the lifestyle and context that they were living. And I cut them a lot of slack. They could not have foreseen how we were going to be as a society even 500 years after they had written and been inspired by those things, much less 2000. It's our source of inspiration, but it has to be read in context. And I'm thankful every day that we have it. But I also know it can be a terrible tool that we use as a weapon for each other, and that I greatly lament.
It is incredibly refreshing for somebody like me to hear you say that. And again, my religious experience was mostly from a Southern Baptist perspective my entire life. My granddad was a deacon. My parents had me in church every Sunday and Wednesday, and I loved it. Like I was very much bought into that for a long time. But I think as I got older, um, and as I read more, as I taught literature in high school and things like that, I began to view, I think, the Bible in a way that you just described it. Like you said, they had no idea when they did the best they could when they wrote it, but they had no idea how much things would change in 50 years, 500 years, whatever it is. Now we're thousands of years past that. And I've struggled with the certainty of people above me who said, this is what it is. This means what it means. And there's no deviation from that. They wouldn't entertain any kind of contextual discourse. And it was frustrating. I will say the last church experience I had was the best one I had. And it was at the Anglican church. Which was for me as a former Southern Baptist a completely different experience than I'd ever had anywhere else. They
I
didn't seem to
bet.
focus on topical issues. It was very much they looked at the Bible as a whole, as an entire like broad story that connected. Um, and they left room for allegory. They left room for contextual interpretation. There was discussion, and it was I enjoyed it. I did, and I can say that honestly. As we come up on an hour, I want to ask you a couple more questions to sort of close this out. And it's sort of looking forward. And we've acknowledged that we're living in a very tense moment in time in America, right? For whatever reason, the last 15 years have sort of built to this. I don't know what happens in November with this election. Like, I'm very disappointed that these are the two people that we have to choose from. But that being said,
You and me
the
both.
two questions are this: the church as a whole, from your perspective, how do you all progress moving forward as these tensions maybe rise or get more heated? Like, how do you move forward as a leader of a church? Are you just going to sort of keep that steady path that you've always done, or are there things that you're going to do a little bit different?
Steady has worked for me. I think steady is always better than reflex. My I'm Irish. Everybody in town's probably figured that out by now. Irish folks are not known for their patience or their temperance in anything, including their manners. So I really have learned from my officiating to stop and listen and replay. But my listening skills, I've tried to up that. And when I did ministry in non traditional places like at a brewery and some other places like that, significantly religious and love the Lord, but they cannot abide the institution of the church. And it is because of its intolerance, its knee jerk reaction to society, rather than saying, okay, let's do some hard work and let's dig in. And even knowing we may still come out disagreeing, we may do so agreeably. Most families get through differences like this, and they don't leave the kitchen table and say they're never coming back. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Sometimes they do. And I think that's where, and I'm a preacher. I don't mind using scripture. And I shared this in a sermon once too. He said, it probably took me 10 years to figure out that the parable about the prodigal son wasn't about the son who went away and squandered all of his dad's uh, inheritance. That parable is about the son who stayed, because his younger brother comes back and his dad's all excited. He wants to throw a party. Everybody on the farm quits working. They go get the fatted calf and do all this kind of stuff. And the older brother's saying, "What the heck, Dad?" Said he what a jerk. Why would you do this? And the older brother totally misses the point. He said, son, I'm not ever worried about you. You've been faithful. Said, I was worried about my other son. Said he was lost. Uh, we don't have that attitude in society. Uh, we want to favor the favorite son instead of the son who left, uh, and need to be willing to welcome them back. What does it take? Um, you know, from the beginning of the Bible, God talked about how everything's a relationship. If you're an Orthodox Christian, you believe in the Trinity. God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, that's a relationship right there. It just seems to be the basis of what it means to be in a relationship is to be in a relationship with God, and that everyone's otherness is respected and grounded in love. And God's love is generous. It overflows all creation. We read that from Genesis 1 on. And so we're stewards of that. We're supposed to take care of that. And we may disagree on how we get there, but, America is becoming less and less Christian. I don't want to throw anybody out that's there. If anything, I want them to come back, and we'll work with them when they get there. And we're all going to be at different stages of our lives and of our faith wherever we gather. There's not a super church anywhere that I know of. I think as a nation we've got to reclaim that, and we used to do it in communities. Uh, you know, Folks were volunteer firefighters. They volunteered to coach ball teams. They volunteered to be den mothers. They did all those things. And volunteerism is going down as quickly as involvement in the church. And I don't think those things are unrelated. You and I were sports officials. It is difficult, if not impossible, to get a young person to be a high school sports official because
Mhm.
people just act crazy and their expectations are ridiculous. Um, that that that's not good for society. It's not good for cities. It's not good for communities. We're always going to have differences of opinion on matters of theology and lots of other things, but on the things that matter, the majors, I'd rather get those right. And so, shoot me if I don't end up in the right place at the end of my life for having tried to major in the majors. We all know folks in both places, so misery loves company, I guess. But I'd rather take the risk on banking on love and grace. Doesn't mean that the church can't have a stand, but when it comes to people, we really got to be welcoming for the son who's lost. And I
Man,
don't know any
Scott,
other way to do that in society except be good to people.
these are the things I think that people like, I don't want to say like myself because I know there are people like that in the church. I think for people who aren't in the church anymore, the only people they hear that are still in the church are people who are saying the things that are opposite from what you just said. So I do think, and that's one of the main reasons I also wanted to have you on here because I knew that you would say things that people who aren't in church need to hear, including me, because I obviously for the last several years have sort of become very, I don't want to say bitter. Well, that's pretty accurate. Bitter towards certain parts of the collective church as a whole, based on how they've responded to certain things. So,
Mhm.
your takes on everything, they were not unexpected. You lived up to all of the expectations I had for this, and they were very refreshing. And like the quotes in the paper that I read yesterday, they were wrapped in grace and empathy. And we need more of that, and we need to communicate that more. I think to people who are hurting and probably feel scared of being marginalized again. So I very much appreciate you taking time to come on here and have this conversation.
I appreciate the opportunity, Gabe. Like I say, we're going to have to meet face to face sometime.
For sure. Thanks so much, Sky. I really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your night and enjoy Father's Day on Sunday.
Thank you so much. Do the same, and God bless you.